first speaker, Evetel Divni, and the title of her presentation is In Allah We Trust, Islamic Activism as Collective Action.
Yeah, I think the applause is just for the fact that we've all lasted this long. So thank you for staying in the room. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to warn you that my approach to scholarship is maybe a little bit different than the other papers that have been presented before. I rely on a lot of statistical analysis of data. So just so you're warned that I don't think that this quantitative analysis answers any questions definitively, but I hope that it starts a really fruitful conversation. So the question that I'm really asking is Islamic activism really faith-based? So the existing literature about Islamic-based activism starts with the puzzle, which is that Islamic-based parties and organizations seem to be more successful, whether they mean that they're more popular, that they're better able to affect change, or that they're longer lasting than very similar organizations that make no reference to Islam. So, my research is based on Turkey, and my favorite comparison is to look at the ruling party, the AKP, with any center-right party that came before them. In terms of policies, they look very similar, but the AKP uses Islam in a way explicitly. The parties before them did it, and they seem to be even more successful than their predecessors. So when the existing literature tries to answer this question, why is it that Islamic-based parties and organizations are more successful, they start with the assumption that says, being political is really hard in the Muslim world. It's harder than it is everywhere else. The costs of being political are higher, the risks of being political are higher, and the benefits, the chances of actually succeeding are actually much smaller. And so the Islamic-based groups have a comparative advantage in overcoming these bigger costs and risks because they can rely on the support of pious individuals. And pious individuals are willing to bear these costs and in risks in a way that non-pious individuals are not. So either because they are so attached to their faith that they just ignore the costs altogether, or that they ascribe to a different set of values that makes them redefine the costs and benefits so that they're willing to participate in a rational way, whereas a secular activist wouldn't. So this is the existing literature. What I'd like to argue is that this view really focuses way too much on the individual and on how the individual thinks about the costs and benefits of activism. And trying to remind everybody that Islamic activism, like activism anywhere, is a form of collective activity. And in collective action, the costs and benefits to myself are also a function of how many other people show up and participate in a particular event. Well, why? Well, because the costs are going to be distributed among the entire group that's there. So the more people that are there, the fewer the chances are that I'm going to suffer in any way. And also, the more people that are there, the better the chances of us being successful. So no matter how I define the costs and benefits for myself, my decision to participate is also really dependent on how many other people participate. And so I'd like to try to convince you today that because of this collective aspect, that trust in other people is a really important foundation for participation. And it's particularly important in the Muslim world because a key form of trust, which is trust in most people, is critically low in the Muslim world. It's disproportionately low. And that, I want to argue, is really the barrier to participation, not any differences in the costs and benefits of activism. And I want to show you that it's not actually faith, individuals' faith in God or in particular religious value that supports more participation in political activities, but it's their regular contact with other Muslims through regular participation in religious activities. So I'm going to now start with a lot of data, but before I do that, let me give you oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that I added the slide. Just to make it really clear, there's very different empirical implications between what I'm saying and what the existing literature says. So if the existing literature is right, we should see less political activism in the Muslim world, and that difference should be explained by differences in costs and benefits. And we should see within the Muslim world higher levels of activism among people with strong beliefs, individual beliefs. If I am right, we should see less activism in the Muslim world, but it should be explained by higher levels of distrust there, distrust in most people. And instead of there being higher levels of activism among people with strong beliefs, we should see higher levels of activism among people who participate more regularly in religious activities. And the reason for that is because distrust of most people should not be a barrier to political participation among those who participate regularly in religious activities. Because I want to argue that it creates a different form of trust, which is trust between Muslims as Muslims, which is different than trust of most people very broadly. So I'm going to just a preview of the results before I start showing you a lot of graphs. I do find there's less political participation in the Muslim world, but it is not a reflection of higher costs or fewer rewards, but actually a reflection of this distrust problem that I've talked about. Religious beliefs are actually associated with less political activism within the Muslim world, whereas participation in religious activities is associated with more activism. And again, distrust is not a problem for participation in political activities among those who participate in religious activities. So they're spending time with other Muslims, and I want to argue, even though I don't have direct evidence of it, I want to argue that it's because they're finding a different basis of trust. So I use survey data from the World Values Survey. I conduct analysis on two levels. First of all is the national level. So we're looking at Muslim and non-Muslim countries, 96 in total. Within that, we've got 16 Muslim majority countries. If you want to test me, you can see me try to name all of them in question and answer, but it is in the paper. But we also conduct level analysis on the individual level within these 16 Muslim majority countries. So most of the Muslim majority countries, there's been more than one survey, and we have a grand total of 46,487 individuals who are going to be analyzed here. Let me tell you how we define some of these variables that I've mentioned. So political activism. The respondents are asked whether they have or would do a number of things. And I have looked at signing a petition, participating in a boycott, or attending a demonstration. And I've combined these into a single index, just to make sure that we're not catching on to any particular strange anomaly. It's easier to have multiple measures. So we look at all three of them together. As examples of religious beliefs, I look at those who say that they believe very strongly that Sharia law should be implemented. I look at those who say it's very important for a woman to veil in public. Those who say that they want more religious individuals to hold higher office. And those who say God is very important in their lives. Now, these are all things about their beliefs as individuals or their relationship to God. It has nothing to do with anybody else. But for religious activities, we have three. One is that they say that they spend time with others in a mosque at least once a week. The second one is they say that they're a member of a religious organization. And the third is that they attend prayer at mosque at least once a week. Okay? And finally, this measure of trust, which I've been getting a lot of questions about. This is the exact phrasing of the question. Generally speaking, can most people be trusted? And I'm about to show you how low trust is in most of the world. So I'm just flashing these out for those who like to read regression tables. I'm about to show you proportions that are going to be a lot easier, but this is essentially just, in the cross-national 96 countries, looking at the index of political participation. The top one is a dummy variable coded 1 if you're in a Muslim majority country, 0 if you're less than 50% Muslim, and you can see that there is a huge participation deficit. If you're in a Muslim majority country, you are significantly less active than you are if you are not. And I've controlled for what is thought to be a great measure of the potential benefits of political activism, which is the openness of the regime to change. So democracy, that doesn't change anything. I've looked at a measure of the costs that activists might be inflicted upon activists, which is the state's use of terror or or force against its own people. That also doesn't change the effect of being in a Muslim majority country. I've even thought outside the box and thought maybe there's more apathy. No, and are they just less dissatisfied? Also no. So we've got an effect that is not going away. Here is another table. In the first two models, the outcome is actually trust. And you'll see again that in Muslim majority countries, there is greater amounts of distrust. In the last three models, the outcome is this participation index again. The first models, 3 and 4, are to show you that there's a strong relationship between distrust and participation across the whole sample. More distrust, less participation. And the kicker is that fifth model, which is showing you that the Muslim majority effect on participation disappears once we control for distrust. So remember, nothing else made that effect disappear, but finally controlling for distrust, and there's no longer a significant difference between Muslim majority countries and non-Muslim countries in terms of political activism. To make it a little clearer, this is the first two graphs are showing you the average participation rates. The first one is across regions. So yeah, the Middle East is definitely dragging this down. But then when we look at Muslim majority versus non-Muslim majority, we still see a significant difference, And then again, you'll see the differences of distrust. Like I said, distrust is high just about everywhere, but it is even higher in Muslim majority countries. So here's, again, a regression table. I'm actually not even going to go through this because the proportions show it just as nicely. But the important thing when we're getting into within the Muslim majority world is that I'm controlling for differences across countries. We're only looking within countries. So this isn't being driven by a particularly religious country here. This is just within each country. If you're a stronger believer, you are less likely to be politically active. And those are those negative signs that you're seeing across the board on that top row. And this is the 4 ways that we're defining beliefs. And here's a preview of the results about religious activities, the 4 ways that we're measuring religious activities. The composite is participation in any of the activities together. And you will see again that there's a positive association just across the board. But here are the proportions. So in here, the dark bars are if you believe or participate, and the light bars are if you don't believe or don't participate. And this is average number of activities that you participate in. And you'll see across the board religious beliefs. If you believe in them, you're less likely to participate in religious activities. If you participate in them, you're more likely to be a political activist. So I'm again just going to breeze through these because it's just too technical. But here's the one that really to me matters. So this is within the Muslim world. I'll take a little bit of time to explain this. Again, what we're looking at is these are models that are trying to explain differences in political participation. Okay? And the first one is showing you, the first 2 models are showing you that distrust within the Muslim world on the individual level keeps people from being politically active. Okay? There's a negative effect of distrust on willingness to be politically active. The next, models 3 and 4 is looking at whether they participate, if they attend weekly services at a mosque. Okay, so what it's showing you, the top 2 numbers are showing you that if you participate in, mosque services, which is a weird way to say it, but if you go to mosque once a week, it may be a slight positive effect, but actually nothing significant. If you distrust but do not go to mosque, it's a strong negative effect. But the third one is showing that if you distrust but you do go to mosque, and there we have a positive effect. It's essentially wiping out the negative effect of distrust. So it's showing that participation in an activity, here it's attendance at weekly service, eliminates the distrust problem for an individual when they're deciding whether or not they want to participate. And that explains the higher level of participation among those who participate in religious activities. Now, here's the proportions again. Now, this is a little, because it's not controlling for differences between countries, you're actually not seeing a distrust problem, but I promise you that when you focus within countries, it's there. It's just that participation levels differ in high distrust countries and low distrust countries, so it's a little funky here, but I just want to show you that if across all 3, if you participate and you distrust, which is the dark bars, there you're more willing to participate in political activities, whereas everybody else is about the same. So when you participate in a religious activity and you distrust, you're actually more likely to be a political activist than any other group. So in conclusion, trust, or what I like to call trust in trust in Allah, does not support more activism in the Muslim world. Identity, trust in other Muslims, is, I'd like to argue, the foundation of Islamic-based politics in the Muslim world. And a potential implication that I hope we can discuss a little bit in Q&A and afterwards is that potentially secular movements in the Muslim world do not fail because they are unpopular, but because they do not have a built-in solution to the problem of distrust, which group identities do, because they can build group-based trust. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Our second speaker is Ferhan Öngör.
Events of communicative action and interfaith dialogue gatherings position Hizmet movement volunteers at various nodal ends of Temsil, embodiment of principles of Quran and Hadith. The principle of Temsil itself is a processual and by degrees nature. At one end, volunteers' communicative behavior at the event level indexes reflexive strategizing of action to benefit from the outcomes of Temsil. At the other hand, communicative behavior indexes habitual forms of temsil that rely on tacit cultural values which do not focus on outcomes. Furthermore, my ethnographic investigation points to certain historical and contextual contingencies that necessitates the urgency for strategic action, and to certain perpetual and enduring concepts of piety that are indexed by habitual action. In between these two nodal ends of communicative patterning of temsil in the here and now of dialogue interactions, various combinations of strategic and habitual behavior are observed. This paper analytically examines actual interfaith dialogue interactions recorded in New Jersey since 2009 to study the interactional order through which the processual and by degrees nature of temsil is emergent and patterned, and how communicative behavior is linked to mentioned micro and macro nuances related to temsil. Hizmet is a transnational civil society movement originated in Turkey in the 1970s. Today, its volunteers are involved in thousands of educational institutions, cultural centers, interfaith dialogue centers, media organizations, relief help, and relief fund organizations all over the world. Hizmet is also highly debated in popular media and also became the focus of many scholarly articles, books, and conferences. Studies on Hizmet movement favors analysis and conclusions based on ethic descriptions of scholars. These scholars by nature bring to the table their respective fields' social scientific agendas when it comes to examine the movement. Most written by political scientists, theologians, macro sociologists, area specialists, and historians, these studies offer valuable insight about the movement by juxtaposing it with state formations, concepts such as secularism, modernity, democracy, matters of authority, individualization, peace and conflict, among others. What are lacking, though, in this equation are studies that concentrate on interactions of Hizmet volunteers with each other and with others, and their reflexive accounts of such interactions. What goes on in these interactions? What are the interactional effects, in other words? What is accomplished in these interactions? How are volunteers positioned in them, as any social interaction positions selves and identities, albeit through interactants' actions? What are the truly cultural conceptual knowledge around which interactants align themselves so that a desired image is projected? And what volunteers think about all this? What do they say they do about what they feel about going through motions such as these? Particularly in interfaith dialogue activities, they choose to be together with others that they wouldn't be together if they were not volunteers of the movement. They choose to build strong relationships with others. In these activities, what they do as meaningful social action is always open to scholarly analysis through ethnography and analysis of transcriptions of what they say and do. How do these meaningful actions circulate in society, and from which interactions, such as ritual centers of value creation, social values attached to verbal and non-verbal signs emanate so that macro-social values are brought into the here and now of interfaith dialogue interactions? This paper concentrates, among all these topics, on the issue of how volunteers engage with the principle of temsil, embodiment of principles of Quran and the Hadith, in their everyday activities within the context of interfaith dialogue. Here the focus is on the social aspect of temsil. Temsil, which might be inadequately translated as to represent, is to set an exemplary life in daily activities following principles of Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Hizmet volunteers engage in lisan-ı hal, in Turkish, or language of dispositions, to share their worldview with others. Based on my ethnographic examination conducted for a different study, ethnographic interviews and analysis of several transcriptions of audio and videotaped interfaith dialogue events, the purpose of the study is to describe how Hizmet volunteers engage with temsil and how they reflect upon it. First, there are two kinds of temsil, or consciousness about temsil, in the everyday lives of Hizmet volunteers. One is the strategic one, and the second is an habitual one. The strategic one is highly organized, patterned, routinized, and done to achieve goals and outcomes. It is important to note here that the goal or the outcomes are not favors in return, but the co-alignment of others. Here others defined very broadly, as Hizmet doesn't relate to only members of other religions, but to everyone that they can reach out to, such as elected officials, law enforcement officers, politicians, business and health practitioners, and scholars, among many others. So co-alignment around the conceptual knowledge of which, when tokens used in language, index particular positions, such as a Hizmet volunteer who is together with others, living with others, peacefully without conflict. So the strategy works around actually to create that effect, the interactional effect. These truly cultural concepts emanating from ritual centers, that is, value-conferring interactions, such as Gülen's talks and writings, articles in numerous books written by Hizmet volunteers, and circulating interdiscursively among other interactions, are used in discursive interactions at interfaith dialogue events, and their use indexed onomic knowledge such as tautonymies, taxonomies, or serial structures in linguistics terms, which in turn align interactants one to another. So we become who we are in interactions by actually positioning ourselves around these conceptual knowledge. For instance, the use of the word dialogue itself, or understanding, friendship, interfaith, so on and so forth, are terms that index conceptual knowledge around which only certain types of people can align one to another. Therefore, when they're used in interaction, in this case interfaith dialogue interactions, they index positions and identities. This knowledge is highly essentialized knowledge. When they're used, they're typically an aha moment. So-and-so talks like a professor, like a police officer, or in our case, like a Hizmet volunteer. Moreover, when these tokens are used in language, they also index positionalities that Hizmet volunteers strategically, especially through istishares, you know, the word comes from shura in the Quranic concept, want to be associated with. Here I put some of my notes from an istishare that I attended. I've been attending these for the last 3 years. This is particularly one that is done in New Jersey by women, actually, all of them. And I only translated it. I didn't put them in any form to actually lose the authenticity of it. But if you look at it, there's nothing actually spiritual about it. It's all like meeting notes of a business meeting. What is important here is that the strategy, the continuous strategy and learned structure of how to be and how to act actually as a Hizmet volunteer in interfaith dialogue. So churches to be contacted, people to meet, phone calls to be made, reminders of various sorts. So here, at this consciousness level, the volunteers are acting extremely strategic. Everything goes by planning. They're very patterned and routinized. Let me move on to 4 characteristics that you can actually deduce from those notes and interactions that I've been following in interfaith dialogue is, and these 4 are based on the difference between denotational content and interactional effect, which means that the content of the interfaith dialogue events typically do not matter. What matters is the interactional effect that it creates. So when we talk about togetherness, for instance, the talk about calling into action others to get together is not the important part, but the important part is whether they are able to sit together and talk together. So for instance, in many dialogue events, the content of the talk is listened by people who are extremely sleepy, taught by speakers who are not experts in their field, but after the talk, there's the whole session about Turkish coffee, baklavas, and food, and people socialize, and only that part counts. And again, strategically, pictures are taken, people standing one next to another to capture the moment. And in the consultation sessions, the istisharas, this point is well made. Take pictures. If no pictures, no event. Because, they will be circulated in catalogs, they will be circulated in brochures, but the important point is not religious concepts getting together, but can individuals get together? Can they find commonalities? Can they actually talk in a non-confrontational way? Can they find topics in a non-confrontational way? I've been following in the past 3 to 4 years also other dialogue events by other organizations, and typically there the content is extremely important. People get together on tables, around tables, they discuss issues, they have tasks at hand, and at the end of the discussion they need to actually report on solutions, such as Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for instance, or differences in terms of understanding of what a prophet is, what a book is, what faith is, what Day of Judgment is, what God is. Here, more importantly, the content, like I said, is not important, but the interactional effect of getting together, finding commonalities, being non-confrontational is really important. And one last thing is the invisible religiosity, which is that Hizmet volunteers typically don't show explicitly their religiosity. If they're organizing an event and if time for prayer comes, they do it almost in a hidden way. They don't announce it, they don't talk about it, they just go and come back. Now, just to show you an example of how this works, and sorry for the long quotation, I just brought one example, and typically in these cases, examples are drastic examples, like, oh, you have Jesus, we have Jesus too, or you have Mary, we have Mary too. But this is actually done in a very mundane and very everyday nature. So in this event, after the talk, which was basically about the basics of Islam, this lady asked, would you agree that within any particular religion is fundamentalism part of the problem? Now, the speaker talked before this about stereotypes about Islam. He said that, most Muslims are known to be sexist, violent, unscientific, so on and so forth. Christian fundamentalists who take the Bible literally, they will be sexist, they will be against science, they will be violent, and they will point to specific passages of the Bible to support their stances like biblical literalists do. Can you say that fundamentalism is part of the problem? Now, he answers, and right from that, actually, you can see that this audience member also already co-aligns with the speaker by putting herself in the same group. We're religious people that are bad fundamentalists, right? So the answer continues on that, and here, particularly pay attention to deictics, pronouns such as yours and you, we and us and ours. So he says, they do precisely how you described it. Quran, as any other text like the Bible and the Torah, can be manipulated in many different ways. This has been our experience. Go and talk to a fundamentalist. The arguments are extremely religious. If we are not up to the date with our Quranic and the prophetic and our Bible and Torah knowledge, we can easily say, whoa, this person knows much more than me and he must be right. That's the basic idea, that people don't research enough, don't read enough. So you see, using these dialectics, that he is already aligning himself in a common way, finding the common ground. You know, the common enemy, the common characteristics of that enemy, and common problems in me, that I don't read enough, that I don't know enough. Did you show me 5 or 3? No.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. There is a second characteristic of the strategic action, and I'll say it very quickly, is the discomfort that the volunteers feel when they enact it. I had many chances to follow them in like township councils or different churches, and what happens is from outside they look like, you know, they're very comfortable in doing this, but there are many cases where they go to the room and actually come back without saying anything because they just couldn't meet with people. Because the strategy behind it is, you know, this is, like I said, it's not a very natural move, so they feel a little unnatural about it. They go, they attend, but they cannot pull it together and say hi to them and leave. I'm cutting short this part, but this discomfort is one of the most distinctive features between the strategic consciousness and the habitual consciousness. Now, the aforementioned distinctive discomfort and uneasiness is inexistent in the second type of temsil, namely the habitual one. Habitual temsil is marked by its lack of reflexive process at the moment that it can be located. In other words, it can be called spontaneous and natural. There's an unnoticed nature to it. Most of the time, the individual who's engaged with it doesn't have consciousness of it, nor a recollection of it afterwards. There are, of course, no traces of planning or uneasiness. Therefore, it also proves to be extremely difficult for the researcher to locate it. So where you can locate it is actually accounts where people recollect them, other people recollect them. So, because of the time constraint, I won't be able to go through it, but there are cases where in dialogue events, people are actually recounting their experiences with Hizmet volunteers and say that all these spontaneous acts of helping and caring actually move them. But by nature, we can easily say that those were unplanned, but also those were unnoticed. Now, the last thing that I want to mention about this is the reflexive part of interfaith dialogue events and how people go through these, on this continuum of strategic and habitual consciousness. Some volunteers consider the matter of strategic and habitual temsil as an ally for spiritual improvement. If I do this strategic, I will achieve habitual eventually. Second, sometimes they bring a nostalgia account. They say, I used to have habitual more frequently, but I lost it. Everything is strategic now. In this modern world, we have to keep up. Third, they want to choose only the habitual one, but they can't, because they say, as following the Gülen's idea of what taqwa is, which is not only limited to individual relationship to God through individual prayer and worship, it is about the responsibility of each Muslim representing his or her religion in the best way within the conditions of times and places that the individual finds himself or herself in. So, very contextual definition of what taqwa is. Some others, lastly, voice their opinion on the fact that strategic temsil might get into the way of habitual one. Although the reason for the strategic one is depending upon the context, such as the image of Islam and Muslims being not where they're supposed to be and therefore used to achieve results faster, something that this might undermine the effectiveness of habitual temsil and be counterproductive. Here again, we see how micro-interactions index values emanating from various ritual centers. On one hand, there's a definition that Gülen provides for taqwa, for instance, which circulates through various publications in others' words. And on the other hand, there are criticisms, especially in Turkey, about the movement being too pragmatic. Here, volunteers oscillate in between these value centers and look for possible ways of acting following the wisdom of Gülen, while also finding ways of not appearing pragmatic. In conclusion, this type of research and analysis yield an understanding of the interactional work that is being done in interfaith dialogue and how interactives reflect upon their own actions. Strategic temsil is not necessarily incongruent with the habitual temsil for Hizmet volunteers. It is rather a continuum on which various individuals oscillate between these two nodal ends. This also showcases that Hizmet movement is not a monolithic entity that can be studied in a uniform body. This is also true for its volunteers, as they are also not monolithic entities interacting with others through static and unchanging modalities. The variety of both actions and reflections upon the actions, and the fluidity that temsil molds in every unique interaction provide evidence for anthropological studies to be conducted with a close attention to what takes place in actual interactions of Hizmet volunteers. Constructs such as sincerity, intentions, or taqwa need to be addressed in scholarly analysis only after following the mechanism of interaction order through which they are indexed in the here and now of actual interactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The title of the last paper of the conference is Post-Communist Transformations of Islam in the Balkans. Please welcome Ina Merjanova.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for having me here and to Niagara Foundation in particular. Thank you, Ihsan, for classifying me as a young scholar. I will take this as a compliment. And finally, I'm particularly honored to be the last speaker of this very interesting conference because this allows me to have the last word. What I'm going to present now today is part of a long research which has been just completed. It's a book project called Muslims in the Balkans Between Nationalism and Transnationalism. So maybe I worked on this book for 7-8 years, and I hope to see it out with Oxford University Press next year. It's just been contracted. So I will basically tell you what my book is about in a very concise way. I'm trying to discuss Muslim communities in the Balkans, which are very diverse, obviously, in the framework of two discursive practices, nationalism and transnationalism, which have been both competing discourses but also interrelated to each other. My interest in Muslim communities comes from the fact that I come originally from Bulgaria, though I'm based presently in Dublin, at Trinity College Dublin, where we have about 13% of the population which is Muslim, and therefore we are the country in the European Union with the highest percentage of Muslim population. Another important rationale behind my interest in this topic is the fact that there has been a lot of research on Islam in Western Europe, particularly after September 11, but also before that, given the ongoing debates on how to integrate Muslim communities in Western Europe, which are relatively newcomers to all the nation states in Western Europe. Sometimes, no, but most often in these debates, Muslims in the Balkans are not even mentioned, and this means that a considerable part of Muslims in Europe, like 8.5 million, live in the Balkans, and they actually are indigenous Muslims, so to say, having been established as communities since the 14th century, and somehow their presence is omitted in this debate. So therefore I try to fill a gap, so to say. Basically, I already mentioned that Muslims in the Balkans are highly diverse populations. So we have around 4.5 million Albanian-speaking Muslims in Albania proper, but also in Macedonia and in Kosovo. Maybe around 2.5 million Bosniak-speaking Muslims, Bosniak in Bosnia proper, but also in the neighboring Sanjak and in Macedonia. We also have like 1 million Turkish population, mainly in Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania. In addition to unknown number estimates varied Roma Muslim population, which is distributed in different countries, but most of them are in Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Romania. So basically we have different linguistic and ethnic groups of Muslims in Bulgaria, in the Balkans, which have been negotiating their national ethno-national identities vis-a-vis mostly Christian majority states after the establishment of these nation states after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire from the end of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century. Except for Albania and Kosovo, all Muslim communities live in majority Christian states, which have been also secularly defined, which means that Muslims in these different countries have developed more or less successful modes of integration in secular societies. I will focus on the post-communist context, which is basically the topic of my research, and it comes, so my interest in Islamic post-communism comes from my original research on religion in post-communist society, given that we had in almost everywhere in the Balkans except for Greece, we had very harsh communist regimes established after the Second World War, and this meant marginalization of religion, not only of Islam but also various traditional Christian denominations, which also meant standstill in terms of religious practices, educational institutions, religious organizations, etc. After the fall of communism and the newly introduced freedom of religion, there were many problems which both Muslim and Christian communities faced. Major problem being, of course, to re-establish their organizational, educational, cultural structures after decades of marginalization and harsh control. So, of course, in different countries, Muslims have been treated differently, and it's, for example, in Bosnia, they were able to somehow revitalize their religious life in their transnational networks already in the late 1960s in the framework of the Titoist changing policies, and particularly in the framework of the movement of non-aligned countries, among which many Arab Muslim countries and Yugoslavia were the major initiators. But this was not, of course, the case in Albania and in Bulgaria, which were the harshest communist regimes. In Albania, for example, all religious, not just Muslim organizations and religious sites were closed down, and this was the country where atheism was inscribed in the Constitution of 1976. So the only country where atheism was pronounced official ideology of the state. So basically, after the fall of communism, Muslims in these countries had to establish their structures virtually from scratch. This meant they depended heavily on foreign investment, foreign funds, and these funds, of course, came with various strings attached to them. Important developments also included the wartime experience of Bosniak Muslims between 1992 and 1995, which also meant various transnational exchange with Arab organizations which came to help their brothers in faith. Also the war in Kosovo, 97-98, which was a different case because very few organizations from the so-called Muslim world came because the Kosovo Liberation Army made a very strong case that they would not accept foreign fighters in their army for various reasons. Major reason perhaps that Serb nationalist propaganda already had gone too far in labeling this war in Kosovo as Islamic jihad. In Bulgaria, another case, fortunately there was no war, but Muslims in Bulgaria were subject to very repressive policies from the 1970s onwards. Bulgarian Muslims are diverse within the community itself, because the majority being Turks, but we also have Bulgarian-speaking Muslims, and we have a very small community of Tatar Muslims, and also Roma Muslims. So these different communities were subject to Bulgarianization in the framework of the building of a homogeneous socialist nation by the communist regime, and initially Roma Muslims and later Pomak Muslims or Bulgarian-speaking Muslims, and lastly Turkish Muslims were subject to change of names and other repressive policies like ban on their traditional attire, even ban on speaking the Turkish language in public places. After 1989 transition to the democratization system, of course Muslims were allowed to get back their names and to return to their traditional customs. So we can see that very different ways of being Muslims are to be found throughout the Balkans. Also different ways of connecting to the transnational discourse of Islam as a religion of a global community of believers. Muslim transnationalism, of course, is not a new post-communist development, because various links and networks existed already during the Ottoman Empire, when Sufi brothers were very active in promoting and spearheading the introduction of Islam among local population, but also Muslims were engaged in educational exchanges, and therefore they had very active, so to say, transnational exchange. With the establishment of the nation states, of course, identities were modeled within the framework of these nation-state projects, where Muslims were minorities, as I already mentioned, in majority Christian states, so they had to negotiate their identities vis-a-vis hostile nation-building projects based in opposition to the legacies of the Ottoman Empire for obvious reasons, and therefore they identified Islam differently in different historical periods. We can say that this is one of the important identity markers, but it's not necessarily the most important. After the fall of communism, with the resurgence of religion in the public sphere, Muslims were able to re-establish their religious identities, but this did not necessarily mean that Islam became a master identifier for all of these communities. For example, among Albanian Muslims, national identity is an overriding principle, maybe because this is a very multi-religious nation in itself. Albanians are divided into Muslims, in a smaller community of Orthodox Christians, and even smaller Catholic Muslim community, Catholic Christian community. To conclude, it is probably fair to say that after the breakup of communism, various transformations of Muslim identities in the region started, and these transformations are far from completed. These transformations will continue to be defined, and also Islam. The role of Islam within these transformations will continue to change, but these complex transformations which depend on external and internal factors like historical legacy, post-communist realities, economic pressures and cultural anxieties, national, regional and global political concerns, Islamic translationism and particularism. Thank you.
We have now 15 minutes for questions and answers.
I have two questions and maybe one more related one for the political participation research. I'm an economist, and so first question, I have been always suspicious of like survey-based reduced form regression analysis. Now, distrust, how would you measure distrust if you ask people, do you trust most of the people or well, in Eastern cultures, trust based on kind of other relationships like family, extended family, it will be a little bit different, how would you measure that? So that's the first question. There might be also a little bit self-selection issue when you are measuring distrust, in the sense that when you ask people, do you attend like Friday prayer? I haven't seen the data itself, but that question generally about men, women in most, like some countries do not attend, then you might have self-selection issue. Maybe among the women, there is no distrust issue, maybe that deficit will be corrected. After all, there is no deficit at all, distrust deficit in Islamic countries. Second related question is the following. As far as I can tell, adjusted R-square you have, it shows how much your variables, independent variables, can explain your dependent variable, that is the political participation. It's around 10%, which means data all, like the model all together can explain only 10% of the variation in the dependent variable. Well, for a cross-sectional analysis, I found that a little bit kind of on the weaker side. But then you use this to pit it against the literature. This saying that political participation and cost relationship, so higher cost, the other literature says that higher cost driving the, well, how would you do that really with 10% of explanatory power? How would you really use this model to kind of say the other literature is right, but the other literature is wrong, but this is right? If you put them into the same model, I might see, the point. So you put the cost and the, belief into the same model and see which one explains the variation better. That's my two questions. I know it was a little bit technical. Sorry, guys.
really learned about many aspects of the different issues in the Islamic countries. But I have 3 questions from each one of the representatives. Here is, I mean, my basic question. When we want to, as referring to the gentleman's point, when we want to measure trust or distrust in the Middle Eastern societies, we have to be very cautious about the measurement, because oftentimes we just, I would say that we are not, at least in this kind of culture, are not trained to be forward or to speak our opinion unless we have put in within a very trustful relationship with the interviews. So I really would like to know, how did you measure this kind of trust and distrust in your interviews? And also, it seems that we, in here, we are just stucking, or we are eliminating ourselves within only the interfaith dialogue. Did you see that this interfaith went beyond only a dialogue and towards the activism? You see what I mean? It's like, did you ever could form an organization that they could work together, or it just went beyond just only dialogue? And for Ina, I think I really would like to know how much Europe, at least now, is. I mean, first of all, is it like a melting pot of the Muslim community that experiencing as the way that they experience in the US, where immigrants had to basically support or admit to the idea of Americanism? Or is it like they can be more independent in terms of their own identity as Muslims?
Are you asking about Western Europe or Southeast Europe? Which Europe?
I'm asking about Balkans.
I'll make a short question, I guess. And this is to follow up on what has been said so far about the distrust issue. There's so many factors that play into how one can measure political activism, especially in the Middle East, in Muslim countries. Things like urbanization, urban space versus rural communities, literacy, cultural background, ethnicity, race. You can be Arab, but of North African background or heritage. So what forms of accessibility you have to the system, to what extent you're able to get into political arena. And also the question of religious affiliation, what specific sects you belong to. You can be in a country like Saudi Arabia or Algeria, but also you have a sense of obstacles when it comes to certain forms of political participation. That's one. The other thing has to do with the conceptual. At the heart of Islam is this issue, this proclamation of the idea that there's no God but God. So the concept of what we call Tawheed, the oneness of God. And out of that idea, it's impossible. And I would be happy to explicate on this more if it doesn't. It's impossible to separate the realm of life into certain different various forms of activism, compartments. It is because of this that when you look at the trajectory of history in the Middle East, what happened to communist and socialist parties? They actually created the secular state, because in the Islamic state, it's impossible to create different compartments. You can't say this is life and this is politics. So that should actually be one way of looking at how activism works into it. Out of that specific view, it's the secular state that actually creates a spiritual vacuum. Look at what happened what happened in Tahrir Square in Cairo? That place, that specific space, was turned into a big, huge mosque. People praying the Fajr, which is the sunrise prayer, as if it's like the afternoon one. Why did that happen?
Two questions. First one.
Very short, please.
Oh, sure. The first one goes to the first speaker, and this is with regard to the lack of trust. You mentioned that the lack of trust basically was one of the biggest problems that hinders political participation in the selected countries that you have studied. And yet we have seen the Arab Spring, which basically was a manifestation of a high level of trust. So how would you respond to this? And the last question goes to the last speaker. You mentioned that the redefinition of the Islamic identity of Muslim communities in Eastern Europe was one of the consequences of the collapse of communism. What other consequences besides that redefining the Islamic identity? Thank you.
Thank you. 3 minutes for each speaker.
Okay, I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. So let me just get to the technical questions first. So I put the simplest models in here because I really wanted it to be clear. So I've put controls for just about everything in here. It doesn't go away. The question about service attendance is not just prayer. It's any service attendance. And actually women have a lower rate of participation in services, but they do still participate in things like Quranic study groups. So they still are going to mosque, but just not for prayer, of course. But it's also why I look at different measures of activities, because women are no less likely to participate in the other types of sociability. As for the adjusted R-squared, I'm not sure which models you're referring to, but survey data is notorious for having very, very low R-squared. It's just because people are weird and it's hard to always pick up on understanding all the diversity between people, but we can talk more about it later. Let me get to some of the questions about how do you measure trust. So I collect these data. These were data that have been collected a number of times, since the early 1990s by a group called the World Values Survey. And this question is varied in a list of about 500 questions. So it's not that there would be any particular emphasis put on this question. It's just that I've pulled it out and placed particular emphasis on it. So yes, we can talk about cultural leanings against answering this question truthfully, but I did find it interesting that when you asked this question, you said in Mediterranean culture, we are not trained to share opinions and we don't trust the interviewer. And so I thought it was really interesting that trust came into your comment about why trust might not be well measured. So the one thing I will say about my confidence in this measure is that we now have a lot of experimental evidence of people playing trust games. And the performance in trust games correlates very, very strongly with, cross-nationally, with answers to the trust question. So I do feel I have some confidence, at least in saying that there is a trust deficit in the Muslim world, whether it's because of the culture. I don't talk about, well, in my dissertation I do, but here I don't. So we can talk about that later. I don't, this is really a very, very small project, which is essentially, I do a lot of work on Turkey and looking at this issue in Turkey. I don't know if you know, Turkey is the 5th least trusted country in the world. So this is essentially making sure that what I am talking about isn't a Turkey-specific phenomenon, but actually also relates to. So I haven't gone into the specifics of all 16 cases, but I like your question about accessibility. And one thing would be maybe urbanization, population density, things like that could get into that even on a higher level. Okay, now the Arab Spring. I was expecting this question. I'm surprised it was the last one. Yeah, writing a project about a participation deficit in the wake of the Arab Spring is kind of ironic. What I will tell you, at the very least, I disagree with you that Tahrir turned into a giant mosque. The first day when Professor Bol was giving a talk, he showed a picture of Tahrir, and it was only in the very corner that people were actually in the middle of prayer. It was potentially 1% of the giant mass of people there. So I disagree with your interpretation, but what I will say is I think spontaneous politics, are possible in the Muslim world. Whether then they can be sustained in everyday politics, if you look at the elections in Tunisia and Egypt that followed the Arab Spring, there was still an advantage to Islamic-based groups. And so even though I believe that the Arab Spring was a largely liberal, secular movement, so it's something to think about, whether Islamic-based groups still have an advantage because they solve the distrust problem. We can talk more about it later.
Thank you.
Well, thank you first of all for the question, because it actually opens for me to go back to my slides that I couldn't show you much. Well, to answer it very quickly, well, do it actually. What I can say is the dialogue event is an initial point. So it actually leads to many different events, not organized by the Hizmet movement actually. So if you look here, some of the stuff is not actually Hizmet's organizations, but they are initiated because they made that connection. And now you have things like Earth Day, a picnic at East Brunswick, Value of Women in Education, and then if you read right below, let's contact the Ukrainian church to co-organize a relief fund event for the victims of the tsunami in Japan. This was actually initiated by the Ukrainian church, but they said, let's call them and follow up with that. So, to cut it short, these are only initial contacts. That's why I said the content is not as important as the interactional event effect, because they just open the way to be actually working together. Then you have a lot of different events where they get together within the community, and that's the crucial part. Not organized by the Hizmet movement, but organized by others, where Hizmet is actually joining the other forces for different matters. Not directly religious matters, but different matters. And to be honest, this group, I've been following many different groups in Northeast. This group of women activists, let's say, is much more active than the others. But the point is, the more they're active, the more they're involved in the interfaith dialogue activities, they make more contact. That opens the door for more programs outside of, the so-called Abraham Table sort of programs. I hope this answered the question.
Okay, I will start from the last question.
So it's a very complicated question, and I will, if I really need to answer it, I need to address it in all its aspects, but I can briefly say that the re-emergence of religion, and in this case of Islam for Muslim communities, went on several different levels. So we had Islam on individual levels, so Muslims becoming practicing and returning to their individual identities as Muslim. On social level, where Islam became or re-emerged as a social factor in common culture for Muslim populations, and then at political level, where we had the establishment of political parties which represented Muslim populations and sort of acted on their behalf. So these are three different levels, and even though interrelated, they do not necessarily go together. For example, in Bosnia, we had this a very interesting case when very secular Muslim population, and I can really say that most of the Muslim population, as the Christian populations in Balkans, are very secular as a result of these 5 decades of communism. So very secular Muslim population brought to power a pro-Islamic party, Party of Democratic Action of Ali Izzet Begovic. But interestingly enough, this pro-Islamic party never actually went as as far as to agitate for Islamic State, and it turned with the time to a very modern discourse and very secular modes of participation in the public sphere. So, of course, this is the picture in Bosnia, and it's completely different in Albania, where Muslims don't even have a political party representing them. Still another case in Bulgaria, where the party representing Muslim population, movement for rights and freedoms, is actually extremely secular, and it claims to represent all the Muslims, but it mainly represents the Turkish Muslim population, but it is very careful to preclude any identifications with either Islam and to be named Islamic Party or pan-Turkish party. So it's and we have still another issue with Muslims in Macedonia. So basically, what somehow unites these different Muslim populations, and here I come to the first question about Europe. And European Union is very high, figures very high in the agendas of not only nation states in the Balkans, but also Muslims in the Balkans. It commands a high emotional and also practical appeal for various reasons, despite this disappointment which Muslims had, especially Bosniak Muslims, for the very late and inadequate reaction of Europe when the war raged in the region. Despite this, European Union is still considered to be the framework within which this conflicting interests and maybe even expansionist and hegemonic nation state building projects like Greater Serbia or Greater Croatia and so on and so forth will be somehow tamed, and Muslims will be able to have their guarantee for rights as minorities within these states. So in this sense, European Union is considered as a framework which guarantees legally the preservation of Muslim identities, rather than as a melting pot which somehow would endanger those identities, despite this ostensible secularism in the European Union. And for example, just one example for the Albanian Muslim community, because there was much talk about Great Albania after the breakup of communism, and how Muslims in Albania proper, in Kosovo and in Macedonia would now start creating Great Albania state. There is no such thing and viable project among these three different Albanian groups, but rather European Union is seen as a possible way of bringing these different Albanian communities together in a way which does not in any way endanger their already developed different identities because of the different historical circumstances within which they existed for 5 decades.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience. Please join me in thanking our speakers. I now invite Professor Mustafa Gökçek for closing remarks.
Thank you all the speakers, and I would just like to briefly cover what we have done. It's been really a very enjoyable 2-day conference with lots of exciting presentations. It's been a joy to listen to all of them. We've covered a very wide scope of disciplines in these presentations, from political science, history to anthropology to media studies. We've had a very wide geographical scope in terms of addressing the issues across the Muslim world and beyond. Africa, Central Asia, US, Canada, Far East Asia, and we've also had a very wide variety of participants and attendees from different parts of the world, from all across the United States, Canada, Turkey. We had attendees from Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, India, Azerbaijan, and others. We had two, we could say, top-ranking keynote speakers. We all enjoyed greatly. All our chairs did their job perfectly in keeping the time, and all the panels moved perfectly. So I thank all of you, all of the speakers and attendees, for doing an excellent job over these 2 days and making this conference a perfect program. We have also, I think, a minimum number of technical flaws, almost none. And we should thank the organizers. First and foremost, of course, we should thank the University of Wisconsin-Madison for hosting this conference with all these wonderful setting and the opportunities that they provided. Dialogue International, I think, should be thanked first for all the volunteers that have devoted their times. I participated, I'm totally immersed in the organization of this one, not this conference, but the first one of the international conferences of Islam. It was, I think, in 2004. And I know that it takes a huge amount of time, a lot of energy, many people who devote their time in this. So Dialogue International and the students and others who are involved in the organization have done a really tremendous amount of job. So please join me in thanking them specifically. Mehmet Ertem is here, and Oğuz Alagöz and others. Thank you. Definitely other sponsors include Global Studies, Niagara Foundation have been at the forefront, Associated Students of Madison, and specifically the Middle East Studies Program with Gülay Şamlıoğlu, thank you, and the Turkish Studies Program, and other individuals who have helped with organizing this conference. Thank you all. We're still proceeding with a plan for publishing a volume that will include presentations that were given in this conference. So please keep in touch if you're interested. If you haven't had a chance to send your paper yet, please do so at your earliest opportunity. Other than that, I would just like to ask if there is anyone who would like to make comments. Any specific points that you would like to share?
Are you going to post the videos online?
It is an idea. I don't know if Mehmet, is that a specific plan?
We will post them on our website.
Sure.
islamconference.org.
Sure. Because my husband is really interested to see all of these panels. So
I'm sure there's a lot of other people who wanted to come who couldn't, and who would want to see that on the videos online. So that'd be really great thing to do. Any other comments, questions? Okay, thank you all for coming, and hope to see you in another ICI in the next couple of years.